Hey guys, Generalist Programmer here, and today we're going to be doing a tutorial on Godot or Godot. So this is going to be a beginner's tutorial on 2D top-down movement, which you can use in your adventure games or your RPGs or even top-down shooters. So here's what we're going to be building. We're going to allow for mouse input, so if we click, our player will move to our mouse. We'll have a bit of an animation while our player is moving, and we will also allow for keyboard input, left, right, down, up, and also be able to allow multiple inputs to move in multiple directions. So let's jump into this tutorial and see how we can put this together. Okay guys, so I've now created a new blank Godot project, and from here what we need to do is we need to create a 2D scene for our player to actually be set up on, and then we can do the movement scripts. So first of all, we'd want to just click over to 2D over here, and then we want to click on 2D scene so that we can create a root node for our basically our game. So we're going to right click and rename this to game. Then the next thing I just want to do is just to save the scene. So I'm going to hit Control S and I'm going to save it as game.tscn. And just to quickly get back to just some explanation on how scenes work in Godot. Godot basically uses scenes as objects or game objects, which we can then reuse and then bring into other scenes as well. So you'll see that when we start creating our player. So the next thing we want to do is we want to create a new scene, and this is where we're going to be creating our player. So we're going to click on this little plus over here, and then we're going to add another 2D scene again. We're going to then right click and rename this to player, and we're going to save it as player.tscn. And then we can actually bring this into our game, and we can right click on the game and go to instance child scene. We can select our player.scene and then open that up. So now that will allow our player to be inside our game scene, and now we need to actually do some setup for our player. So we're going to add a few things here just to get our player set up. So the first thing is going to be a Kinematic Body 2D, which is going to allow us to move our character around in our scene and have some functionality in order to do that. So first we're going to right click on our player and we're going to add a child node. Or you could press Control A as a shortcut. And let's just add this child node, and we're going to search for Kinematic Body 2D, and we're going to hit create. So now you'll see that there's a warning here, and the reason for this is that Godot needs a collision shaped 2D object to have, which we can then use to do collision detection and allow us to have some type of bounding box around our player. So that's what we're going to create next. We're going to right click on Kinematic Body 2D, and we're going to add a child node, and we're going to search for collision shape 2D. We're going to click create. Then the next thing is we need to create a sprite and an animation player, because we need to animate our player a little bit, and the sprite is where we actually put in our graphic for our player. So we're going to head over to Kinematic Body 2D again, and we're going to right click and add a child node called sprite, and we're going to hit create. So now you'll see that there's a slot over here called texture, and this is where we can actually drop our player sprite or image. And as you see, I've already loaded mine in here, so I'm just going to drag this over to texture. If you want to get this into your scene or into your project, you can just simply drag and drop it into the file system section over here. Right, so now we've got a player in our scene, and now the next thing we want to do is just make sure that our collision shape 2D actually fits with our player. We're going to click over there, and then we're going to go over to this shape portion, and we're going to select a circle shape for this because our player is round. If you've got a square or rectangle shape player, then please do select the appropriate shape for it. Right. And then we're just going to hide our player so that we can actually see this. I'm going to head over here again, and we're just going to bring it up slightly so that we can then adjust it. And we're going to show our player again, and then just bring this down to fit more or less on our player and how it would actually have to collide. So the eyes and the bottom part here and the top part of the player. Okay, so that's now our collision. Next, we need to add an animation player so that we can actually do some animations on our player. So right click on Kinematic Body 2D again and add a child node. So now we're going to search for animation player and click create. Alright, excellent. So now the next thing we want to do is we've now got this where we've got our player and we've got a collision, bounding box and all of that. Now we need to actually just do a little bit of animation. So by clicking on our animation player, we can then go down into animation over here, and you'll see there's just this basic little panel that opens up, and then you can click on this animation button and we can click on new. So the first thing we're going to do is a very basic animation. We're just going to call it idle. Now you can obviously change the animation any way you like, but for the essential part of this tutorial, this is not completely an animation tutorial, so I'm just going to leave the idle as basically where the player is just standing still, not doing anything, but you can go and edit it any way you like. Then the next animation we're going to add is a walk animation. So we're going to again click on that button and click new, and we're going to call it walk. So now what we need to do is we need to actually animate the Kinematic Body 2D because we want to have the collision shape also morph with the size of our player, because we're going to be doing a scaling animation for this. So I'm going to go over to Kinematic Body 2D, and I'm going to come down here and I'm going to click on add track. Then we want to click on property track, and then we're going to select Kinematic Body 2D over here. And then what we want to animate on is the scale. So we'll just click on scale and hit open. Now you'll see we've got a few frames here, so we're going to make this a very short animation. So this is the start frame, this is the middle frame, and then finally the last frame. So to start off with, I'm just going to create a key for that frame, and what I need to do here is we just want to work with scale. So I'm going to disable this, and so this is location and rotation, and then this is scale, and then I'm going to hit the key icon over here to create a keyframe. So next we want to do is want to move over to the middle here, and then we want to go and resize our Kinematic Body 2D. So in order to do that, we go over to the right and we look for the transform. So for this, I'm just going to alter the y-axis slightly. So I'm going to change the y scale to 0.5. And then you can see that's just going to make our player a little bit smaller. And then I'm going to hit the key again. Then for our last frame, we're just going to reset the size. So let's just make this 1. And we insert another keyframe. So let's just play this back. So you'll see it just does that. So the next thing we need to do is just make sure that it actually will repeat and loop when we actually bring this into our scene. And we need to just add this for autoplay when the walk does happen, so that we don't have to explicitly say play all the time for it. Okay, great. So that's our animations and our player. Let's just go back to our game scene. Here what we want to do is we want to make sure that our player is set at 0, 0, 0 on our transforms. The position is all zeroed out and we're good to go. So when we do move with our mouse, we're going to get a global position, and then this offset of our actual player against the world space is going to cause a weird effect. So we want to keep our player in the 0, 0 position. Okay, so now it's time for a little bit of scripting. We're going to be using a language called GDscript, which is similar to Python in many ways. It's got loose typing, and you can also have explicit types where you can then define as ints and whatever else you need to do. But for this tutorial, we're not going to cover all of that. We're just going to get our player moving with some basic functions, which we can get from the Kinematic Body 2D object. So to start off, let's just go back into our player scene, and we're going to right click on our Kinematic Body 2D. And then what we will do next is attach script, and we will just simply hit create. Which will then give us this window, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to clear all of this out. We're just going to keep extends Kinematic Body 2D for now. And then we're going to start off with some basic variables which we need. So the first thing is I'm going to use export. Export allows us to actually see our variable in our inspector. So I'll show that to you in a second. So let's just call this speed and set it to 200 initially. So if we then look at our inspector over here, you'll see that we now have the speed variable. So that's nice if you want to then just set up your player later on. And let's just go back again and start with the next few variables. So another one of these variables is the var target. So this is going to be where we want our player to move to when we click our mouse. We're just going to set that as a vector 2 initially. And then we need a velocity so that we know how fast the player should be moving and in what direction, because velocity has direction built into it. So var velocity equals a vector 2 as well. And then I'm just going to add an additional variable, because what I want to do is that when we do click with our mouse, we don't want to allow our user to be able to move the player with arrow keys or anything like that. You can obviously change the rules of this, but this is just the rules for this tutorial or how we're going to do it. So for that, I'm going to create a var moving via mouse. And this is going to be a Boolean value. So it's going to be either true or false. We're going to initially set it to false. And then the next thing we want to do is we want to create an input function which allows us to get the various different inputs. But before we do that, we need to actually map our input to certain keys. So for us to do that, we need to head over to project settings, and we need to click on input map over here. So I'm going to add a right for when we press the right button, a left for when we press left, up for when we go up, and down for when we go down. So what you can do now is you see that you've got these various actions, and that's what we call them, actions. We can then assign them keys. So by clicking the plus and you go to key, you can assign whatever key you like. I'm just going to use the right key on the keyboard, and then I'll just assign the rest of these, and you can assign them to whatever you want. So you just decide up and then finally down. Okay, right, great. So now we can close this. So now we've got some type of mapping, and now we can actually start getting some input. The first thing we want to do, we just want to create a function called getInput, and just something about GDscript. The style guide is if you have to do, for example, naming conventions for functions, and it's getInput, it will always be splitting the words with underscores for your functions. All right, so you hit enter, and then it's going to give us this nice little indentation. So if you know Python, use indentations to break up constructs for certain functions or if statements or so on. So this is basically the same thing with GDscript. So now, first thing we just want to do is we want to set our velocity to 0 vector essentially. So we're just going to give it a vector 2 on each case that we get the input. And the reason for this is that there's often some velocity that remains afterwards after the movement, which could allow a shake of our player or something like that. So we always just set it every time we get input, and then we can actually just make sure we don't get those bugs or those weird effects in our scene. Okay, so velocity equals vector 2 to zero that out. And then the first thing we want to do when we get our keyboard input, we want to make sure that we're not moving via our mouse. So we're going to have an if statement, and we're going to say moving via mouse, and we're going to make sure that's false. Next, we want to now start getting input for our various directions, so right, left, up, and down. So to do that, it's very simple. If input dot is action pressed, and then we can select right, start off with, and then what we want to do is we want to give our velocity a direction. So if you look at, for example, the x-axis, so if you're moving right, you're basically moving from where we would start on this side with the x-axis all the way up to, say, 10 on the x-axis. We'll be moving from left to right. So for us to give a direction for the velocity in the x direction, we need to increase the velocity x by 1. So we're going to then set velocity plus plus equals 1, and that will then give us that direction. Next, we want to do the left, which is then just going to be the opposite. It's going to be in the negative direction. Going to select left, and we're going to say velocity dot x minus equals 1. Right. So now we need to do in the up and the down direction. So actually in Godot, the negative direction is up and the positive direction on the Y is down. So for this, we're going to then again use inputs. It's action pressed again. And we're going to first of all start with up. Let's type up here, and then we will give the velocity y a negative direction. So velocity dot y minus equals 1 to give it a negative direction. And then finally we want to do the down movement. So that's if input dot is action pressed and down. Right, and then velocity dot y is going to be in the positive direction, so plus equals 1. Okay, so now we want to next do our mouse input. So in order to do that, I'm just going to again use the input variable, but we're going to use a different method. So it'll be if input dot get mouse button pressed. Get that right. Is mouse button pressed, and then we want to get the left button. So there's an integer which is defined in Godot, which we can use for this, and it's called button underscore left, and then that will get the left button click for us. Okay, so now we need to get our target. So we said that we define our target for where our mouse pointer is, and then we're going to get it when we actually do our click event. So to do that, we need to use set target equal to the get global mouse position. Let's just fix our indentation here. It doesn't quite look right. Okay. And then the next thing is we need to set that we are moving our player via the mouse. So we need to set that to true because we did a click event and now we're actually moving via the mouse. So now all these events will now be blocked and only this will be able to run. Okay, great. So we've now got our input, and the next thing is that we need to play some type of animation because we are actually now moving. So in order to do that, we can use the shorthand $, which basically is equivalent to this. So if we had to say animation player with a get node method, the equivalent to that is just using a $, and going down to animation player. Then we simply just need to say dot play, and we need to play our walk animation. Alright, great. So that's that for our get input. Now we need to actually run our physics process method. A physics process method is specifically made for physics changes on every frame. And we're going to use that instead of the normal process because that is not really well suited for physics types changes in our scenes. So we're going to start off with a function, and this is a predefined method. So we'll just go to physics_process, and it will have a delta. So the delta is like a delta time, which allows us to sync our frames slightly. We're not going to use it in this tutorial, but you have to actually have it in your physics process for Godot to actually recognize the function that you're trying to call. So on the next line, we're just going to simply get input. So that's our get input method or function that we wrote here. Then the next thing is we want to just check if we are moving via the mouse, because we're going to apply different types of velocities depending on which input we used. So for that, we need to set up a little bit of an if statement just to check if we're moving via the mouse. So we'll say if moving via mouse. And then how we're going to calculate our velocity based on the mouse click is we're going to use our target, which is our get global mouse position, where we actually clicked with our cursor, and then we're going to take our current position of our player, which is the kinematic body 2D, and we're going to subtract those two, and then we're going to normalize that. And normalizing basically means that if we've got, for example, a vector of 2.5 and 2.5, then we'll normalize it down to a range between 0 and 1, but it will still represent the same direction that this vector will create. So for that, we then need to just simply take the velocity, and we're going to set that to our target and minus position. So just something which is a little bit confusing about GDscript is that now we're using position here, but we don't have position anywhere in our script. So all you need to know is that Kinematic Body 2D has a position variable, and this is something that happens with object-oriented sort of programming, is that you could have this scenario where position is actually coming from Kinematic Body 2D. So just make sure that you actually know that and that you understand that. If this is too much of a difficult concept, you can use self dot, and then you can get a list of all the different variable types that you can actually get and methods you can get from the Kinematic Body 2D. So that might just make it easier, or you could just go read the Godot documentation on GDscript. Okay, so now we're going to normalize it, and then we're going to just multiply it by our speed. So essentially it's normalizing it down to a range between 0 and 1, and then it's going to multiply it by our speed, and then that is going to move our player at the speed in that direction when we do our click. Right, so the next thing we need to do is we need to now see if our player has actually reached its destination or not. So I'm going to have an if where we calculate some distances. And that is actually quite easy to do in Godot because we have some methods we can use. So for example, we're going to first use the if statement, and we're going to take our position. And it's got this nice little method called distance2. And then you can just simply put in your target, and that'll give us what we call a linear value for our output. So generally, if you had to take, say, target minus position, and they're both vector 2s, it will return a vector 2, which you can't just simply then just say less than 5. But distance 2 will have basically a linearized value between the distances, and we can use that. So why we use the value 5 is just to give our script a little bit of leeway, so that if our player doesn't exactly move to the exact position, it will basically check, is it within this range, then it will do something. So we'll go for less than 5 just to iron out any weird bugs. And then finally we're going to just check, are we moving via the mouse? So I'm going to bring in moving via mouse here just to make sure. And then finally we're going to set our moving via mouse to false, because we think, or we know that we've now reached our destination. And then what we want to do is just set our velocity to 0 again, just to avoid any weird jitter when we do stop, so that it doesn't have any leftover velocity which will allow our player to shake. So we set our velocity to vector 2.0. So that will just zero out the vectors. And then finally what we need to do is, if the velocity is 0 and our player is stopped, we actually need to change the animation. So if velocity is equal to vector 2.0, so this is just going to apply for both when we move via the keyboard or via the mouse. So then we're going to then set the animation player to play an idle animation. Right. And then again, we just want to now apply some velocity so that we can actually do some movement. So for that we need to come down and we need to go one space back so that we don't actually run the code under this if statement. It's actually for this function. So then we're going to set the velocity equal to velocity, and we're going to make sure that it's normalized and finally multiply it by the speed. Okay. Then what we want to do is we want to actually do the movement. So we're going to take velocity and we're going to say move and slide with the velocity that we have. And then just as a precautionary measure, we're going to set our velocity back to 0 again. So we're going to say velocity equals vector 2.0. Okay, great. So let's now try and just run this and see if there's any issues. Let me just check. I've added my player to my game scene. I've set up the Kinematic Body 2Ds, got our script. Okay, great. I think this is going to work. Let's hit run. Okay, so now we just need to select our main scene, so we'll do that. We'll select game and open that up. So Godot does this sometimes when I'm actually recording. So what I'm going to do is just move this over to the other monitor. And I'll just cast that as well. Not the one over here. All right. Sure, get the right one. Yeah. Okay, great. This one. Just move this over here. I can try run again. You'll see there we go. It runs. So now let's click, and you'll see an animation, and it stops at the mouse pointer. Let's try left and right, up and down. So there we go, guys. That's how to do this. This is a good starting point for you to just get a player going, so that you can then move on to maybe creating items and enemies and do item pickups. So with all of this already in mind, you've got collisions and everything. You can then actually start doing some intersections between items and then start doing some pickups. So anyway, guys, this is the end of the tutorial. If you like this tutorial, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and if you want the source code will be available in the description. You can just click on the link there and go download it, and then you can also just open this up and just look at the project and see how it works. Okay, great, guys. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one. Cheers.